Political philosophy, power, justice, and the state. Introduction to political philosophy. Welcome to your first lesson. In this initial segment, we will begin our journey at the very beginning by defining our subject. What is political philosophy? And what are the fundamental questions it has sought to answer for thousands of years? Let your mind settle as we begin. Let us first consider the two words in our title, political and philosophy. The word political comes from the ancient Greek word polis, which simply meant the city or the community. For the ancient Greeks, the polis was the center of life. It was the framework in which people lived together, debated, made laws, and built a shared world. So, at its heart, the political part of our study refers to how we, as humans, live together in groups, from a small town to a great nation. It is the study of our shared life. The second word, philosophy, is also Greek, a combination of philo, meaning love, and sophia, meaning wisdom. Philosophy is, quite simply, the love of wisdom. It is the practice of seeking understanding through reason by asking why. When we combine them, we get political philosophy, the love of wisdom about our communal life. It is the reasoned, systematic pursuit of the fundamental truths about how we ought to live together. This word, ought, is the most important key to understanding our subject. Political philosophy is what we call a normative discipline. It does not simply describe the world as it is, it asks what the world should be. Let that concept settle in. There is a related field, political science, which is descriptive. Political science seeks to describe reality. It asks, how does a person get elected? Or, what are the precise steps for a bill to become a law? It is a study of facts, data, and processes. Political philosophy, our subject tonight, is normative. It asks, what makes an election fair? Or, what should the law be? It is a study of values, ideals, and justification. We are not just observing the machine, we are asking if the machine is good. To do this, political philosophy poses a set of great foundational questions. These are questions you may have wondered about yourself. Questions like, what is justice? What does it mean for a society to be fair? Does it mean everyone gets the same amount, or that everyone gets what they deserve? What is liberty, or freedom? Does it mean being left alone by the government, or does it mean having the actual capacity and resources to achieve your goals? What is power? Why do some people have it, and others do not? And, perhaps the most important question of all, what gives a government authority? Why do we obey the law? What gives any group of people the right to rule over others? This is the question of legitimacy. These are the questions we will be exploring. They are not riddles. They are practical inquiries into the foundations of our shared lives. These questions are not new. As long as people have lived in communities, they have wrestled with them. But the formal tradition of Western political philosophy began in a specific time and place, ancient Athens, in the 5th and 4th centuries B.C. The figure who stands at the beginning of this tradition is Plato, and his work was born from a crisis. Plato was the student of a famously brilliant and disruptive man named Socrates. Socrates spent his life walking the streets of Athens, questioning everyone, politicians, poets, and craftsmen, about what they truly knew. He often revealed that their confidence in their own knowledge was misplaced. For this, the city of Athens, its democratic government, put Socrates on trial for impiety and corrupting the youth. They found him guilty and sentenced him to death. This event deeply shook Plato. How could the polis, the community, kill its wisest and most virtuous citizen? This question led Plato to a life of philosophical inquiry. It forced him to ask, what went wrong with our government? What is the ideal form of a state? What is the true nature of justice? To answer this, he wrote his most famous work, The Republic. In this book, Plato attempts to design, in words, a perfectly just city. He does this not as a literal blueprint, but as a thought experiment. He uses the analogy of the city as the soul writ large. He believed that by designing a just community, we could see, as if through a magnifying glass, what it means for a single person to be just. This single work, The Republic, set the agenda for almost all the political philosophy that would follow. Plato's student, Aristotle, took a different approach. While Plato was interested in the perfect, abstract ideal, Aristotle was a grounded biologist, interested in the real world. He and his students collected and studied the constitutions of over 150 different Greek city-states. He wanted to understand what types of government exist, which ones are successful, and which ones fail. It was Aristotle who gave us one of the most famous phrases in this field. Man is by nature a political animal. He did not mean we are all politicians. He meant that we are not like cows in a herd or bees in a hive. We are animals who possess logos, reason, and speech. And we use this speech not just to communicate, but to debate and determine what is good, what is bad, what is right, and what is wrong. For Aristotle, to live a fully human life, one must live in a community and participate in this shared process of moral reasoning. This is why politics, for him, was the master art, the art of creating a good life for the community. You might be thinking that these are very old, very abstract ideas from ancient Greece. But the truth is, these concepts are embedded in your daily life. They are not distant. They are immediate. When you read the news about a new law being passed, the debate behind that law is a philosophical one. It is a debate about the proper role of government, or a conflict between a desire for security and a desire for liberty. When you vote in an election, you are not just choosing a person. You are, even if you do not realize it, making a choice between competing political philosophies. One candidate may represent a vision of justice that prioritizes individual freedom and free markets. Another may represent a vision that prioritizes social equality and a community safety net. These are both philosophical positions. Even the simple act of paying your taxes is an expression of political philosophy. It is a quiet agreement, a form of social contract, where you give up a portion of your property in exchange for shared goods, like roads, security, and public education. You do not have to study political philosophy to have one. You already do. It is the collection of assumptions and beliefs you hold about what is right, what is fair, and what the purpose of government should be. If you are still awake, just take a moment to consider this. Think of a political issue you feel strongly about. Now, ask yourself why you feel that way. What deeper principle of fairness, or freedom, or safety does that issue touch for you? That principle that is a piece of your own political philosophy. The purpose of this course, therefore, is not to give you a philosophy. It is to help you examine the one you already have and to understand the great ideas that have shaped the world you live in. Now that we have defined our subject, and we understand that we are on a quest to find what is good and what is just in our communal life, we must start with the most basic building blocks. Before we can even discuss what a good government is, we must first understand the most basic element it wields. This is the force that underpins all political life. This force is called power. But power alone, the simple ability to force someone to act, is a very unstable thing. To build a lasting state, power needs to be transformed into something else. It needs to be seen as rightful. In our next lesson, we will begin this foundational work. We will carefully define and distinguish between three of the most important concepts in our entire study: the concept of raw power, the concept of authority, which is the right to use that power, and the concept of legitimacy, which is the belief of the people that this authority is valid. Let your mind rest. You are beginning to understand, and our next lesson will be waiting when you are ready. Defining power, authority, and legitimacy. In our previous lesson, we defined political philosophy as the search for what is just and good in our shared life. We established that we are asking normative questions about what ought to be. Now, as we continue our journey, we must examine the very forces that shape this shared life. We must build our foundation. All of politics, all of government, all law revolves around three central concepts. They are power, authority, and legitimacy. These words are often used interchangeably in our daily lives, but for our study, they have very specific and different meanings. Understanding the distinction between them is perhaps the most critical first step in understanding politics. In this lesson, we will carefully separate and define these three ideas. Let your mind relax as we explore the forces that structure our world. Let us begin with the most basic, most fundamental concept, power. At its simplest, power is the ability to make someone do something, even if it is against their will. It is the capacity to impose your will upon others. This kind of power can come from many sources. It can be physical force, what we call coercion. It can be the threat of violence. It can be the control of a vital resource, like food or water. It can also be a form of influence, like wealth or social pressure. Power is a raw fact. It is the what is. A strong wind has the power to knock down a tree. A bully has the power to take another child's lunch money. In both cases, a will is being imposed. Now, let us consider the second concept, authority. Authority is different. Authority is the right to wield power. It is not just the ability to make someone act, but the justification for doing so. It is power that is seen as proper, just, and rightful. If power is a fact, authority is a claim. It is the claim that this power is being used correctly. Let us use a simple analogy to make this clear. Imagine you are walking down a street and a person in plain clothes jumps out from an alley, points a gun at you, and demands your wallet. This person has power. They have the clear, coercive ability to make you do something against your will. Now, imagine a different scene. You are driving your car, and you are stopped by a person in a police uniform who shows you a badge and tells you to pull over. This person also has power. They are armed, and they are backed by the force of the state. But they also have something the thief does not. They have authority. Society has granted them the right to use this power in specific ways. You pull over not just because of the gun, but because you recognize the rightfulness of the uniform, the badge, and the laws they represent. This brings us to our third and most important concept, legitimacy. If authority is the claim to a right, legitimacy is the popular acceptance of that claim. It is the belief of the people. Legitimacy is what turns coercive power into rightful authority. It is the why behind our obedience. Let us return to our analogy. The thief has power, but no authority and no legitimacy. The police officer has power and claims authority. But it is your belief, and the shared belief of the society around you, that this officer's authority is valid, that this system of laws is just, which provides the legitimacy. A government that rules only by power, only by force, is a tyranny. It is a government of thieves. It is unstable because it must constantly spend resources to force its people to obey. A government that rules with authority, backed by legitimacy, is stable. The people obey the laws not simply because they fear punishment, but because they believe the laws are, for the most part, just and that the government has the right to make them. Legitimacy is the most important foundation for any stable political system. It is the consent of the governed. This question of why people obey the question of legitimacy was a central concern for one of the founders of modern sociology, Max Weber. Weber was a German thinker who wanted to understand how states functioned. He observed that stable states, or any stable form of rule, could not rest on force alone. They needed legitimacy. He asked, where does this belief in a government's right to rule come from? Weber identified three ideal types, or three main sources of legitimate authority. The first type he called traditional authority. This is authority based on custom, tradition, and long-standing practice. People obey because, quite simply, it has always been this way. The authority is vested in the sanctity of the past. The most obvious example is a monarchy. A king or queen rules not because they are necessarily the smartest or the strongest, but because their family has ruled for generations. The authority is seen as legitimate because it is inherited, passed down through a sacred line of succession. This type of authority is stable, but also rigid and resistant to change. The second type Weber identified is charismatic authority. This authority is based on the personal qualities of a single, extraordinary individual. Charisma is a Greek word meaning gift of grace. This leader is seen as heroic, saintly, or possessing a special destiny. People obey not because of tradition, but because of their personal devotion and emotional attachment to this leader. This is the authority of a great revolutionary figure like Nelson Mandela, or a religious prophet, or the founder of a new movement. Charismatic authority is incredibly powerful and can bring about massive social change, but it is also deeply unstable. Why? Because the authority rests entirely in one person. When that person dies, the authority vanishes, and the movement often fractures, unless it can be transformed into one of the other types. The third, and for our modern world most important, type is rational legal authority. This is the authority that forms the basis of all modern democracies and bureaucracies. In this system, authority is not based on the past or on a person, but on a system of clear, impersonal laws. We obey the office, not the person holding it. Think about a modern president, a prime minister, a judge, or the police officer from our earlier example. Their authority comes from a set of rules, a constitution, a legal code that clearly defines the limits of their power and the process for how they gain their office. We obey the president not because we personally like them, but because we accept the legitimacy of the election that placed them there. We stop for the police officer not because of who they are, but because we accept the legitimacy of the law that grants their uniform its authority. This system is rational because it is designed to be logical, predictable, and fair, applying the same rules to everyone. These three concepts, power, authority, and legitimacy, are not just academic terms. They are the invisible forces at play in every political event you see. When a government loses legitimacy, it must rely more and more on raw power. When a dictatorship's people stop believing in the government's right to rule, that government must send in the army. It must use coercion, fear, and violence. It has lost its authority and is left with only power. This is a very brittle and fragile state to be in. Consider what happens when there is a disputed election. When a large group of people marches in protest, they are not just questioning the power of the newly elected official. They are mounting a direct challenge to that official's legitimacy. They are claiming that the process, the rational legal system of rules, was broken or unfair. They are, in effect, saying, "You may have the power of the office, but you do not have the authority, the right to rule." This is why legitimacy is so precious, and why stable governments guard their legal and electoral processes so carefully. If you are still awake, let that idea settle in. Think about your own government. When you obey a law, like stopping at a red light when no one is around, why do you do it? Is it fear of punishment, raw power? Or is it a general belief that the law is a good rule and that the government has the right to make it? That belief, that quiet, general consent, that is legitimacy. It is the glue that holds the entire political structure together. We have now established what power is, what authority is, and how that authority gains legitimacy from tradition, charisma, or law. But this raises a much deeper, more fundamental question. Why do we have any authority at all? Why do we create these powerful states in the first place? We are all born as free individuals. Why do we agree to give up some of our freedom and accept the authority of a government? To answer this, philosophers created a famous and powerful thought experiment. They tried to imagine what life would be like without any government, any laws, or any police to enforce them. This imaginary condition was called the state of nature. In our next lesson, we will explore this very thought experiment. We will ask what life would truly be like in a state of nature, and see why, for better or worse, humanity chose to create authority. Thought experiment, the state of nature. In our last lesson, we carefully distinguished between power, authority, and legitimacy. We established that stable governments are built not on raw power, but on authority that the people believe is legitimate. This, however, leads us to a much deeper question. Why do we have government at all? Why do human beings, who are born as free individuals, universally agree to give up a portion of their freedom and place themselves under the authority of a state? To answer this, many of the most important philosophers in our tradition developed a powerful intellectual tool. It is a thought experiment known as the state of nature. In this lesson, we will explore this famous concept. We will imagine what human life would be like in a hypothetical condition before any government, any laws, any police, or any society existed. The state of nature is not a specific time or place in history. You should not picture it as a literal prehistoric era. Rather, it is an imaginary device, a what-if scenario. Philosophers use it to strip away all the layers of civilization, the laws, the customs, the police, the courts, to try and see what human nature itself is really like in its most raw form. By understanding what life would be like without a state, they believed we could understand why we created the state in the first place. Let us begin with perhaps the most famous and stark vision of the state of nature, that of the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Writing during the chaos of the English Civil War, Hobbes had a deeply pessimistic view of human nature. He argued that in the state of nature, humans are driven by two primary things: the desire for self-preservation and a restless hunger for power. He believed that we are, at our core, fundamentally equal in our ability to harm one another. The strongest person can be killed by the weakest through secret plotting, and the smartest can be outwitted. Because of this equality, and because resources are scarce, the state of nature is a state of constant, paranoid competition. Hobbes famously called it a war of all against all. In such a condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit of industry is uncertain. There is no farming, no art, no science, no culture. Worst of all, there is continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, in Hobbes's most famous phrase, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, the state of nature is a terror, an unending nightmare of terror. Now, let us turn to a second and very different perspective. This is the view of another Englishman, John Locke. Locke's vision of the state of nature is far more moderate and has been far more influential on modern democratic thought. Locke did not see a horrific war of all against all. He believed that even in the state of nature, humans are governed by a natural law. This law, given by God, teaches us that all people are equal and independent. And because we are all God's property, no one has the right to harm another in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. So, for Locke, the state of nature is not a state of war. People have natural rights, the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property that exist before any government is ever formed. People are rational. They can cooperate, they can farm, and they can build. You may be asking, if Locke's state of nature is so peaceful, why would anyone leave it? Locke's answer is that it is inconvenient. In the state of nature, there is no impartial third-party judge. If someone steals your crops, you are your own judge, jury, and executioner. You must enforce the law of nature yourself. This leads to endless cycles of retaliation and disputes. people are biased in their own favor. Small disagreements can escalate into violent feuds. The state of nature, for Locke, is not a nightmare, but it is unstable, uncertain, and inefficient at protecting the property and rights that people already possess. These two views, one horrific and one inconvenient, dominated the discussion for many years. But a third, radically different vision was later proposed by the Swiss-French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau looked at both Hobbes and Locke and said they had made a fundamental mistake. He argued that when they looked into the state of nature, they did not see natural man. Instead, they saw civilized man, with all of his greed, his jealousy, his pride, and his ego, and simply stripped him of his government. Rousseau tried to imagine a human being who was truly pre-social. He called this person the noble savage. This primitive human, in Rousseau's view, is solitary. They are not in a war with anyone because their paths rarely cross. Their needs are simple: food, water, sleep. They are strong, healthy, and self-sufficient. They are not vicious like Hobbes's man because they have no one to compete with, but they are also not virtuous like Locke's man because they have no concept of morality or law. They are pre-moral. For Rousseau, this natural human is driven by two principles: a simple love of self, self-preservation, and, crucially, a deep natural pity or compassion. He believed we have a natural dislike of seeing any other sentient being suffer. So what, according to Rousseau, corrupted this peaceful, content, noble savage? In one of the most famous passages in all of philosophy, Rousseau identifies the exact moment of the fall. He writes, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society." For Rousseau, it was the invention of private property. This, he argued, was the origin of all inequality. It introduced jealousy, pride, labor, and the division of humanity into the rich and the poor. It was this civilization, not the state of nature, that created a state of war, and governments, in his view, were first created by the rich to trick the poor into protecting the property of the rich. Now you may be wondering, why does this matter? Why spend so much time on an imaginary scenario? It matters because this thought experiment is a profound diagnostic tool. The way a philosopher diagnoses the disease of the state of nature will determine the cure they prescribe. The cure, in this case, is the type of government they believe we should have. Let this idea settle into your mind. If you are Hobbes, and you believe the disease is a brutal, constant war of all against all, you will prescribe a very powerful cure. You will advocate for an absolute sovereign, a leviathan, a government with total power. For Hobbes, any government, even a tyrannical one, is better than the horrors of the state of nature. The purpose of government is simply security, at any cost. But if you are Locke, and you believe the disease is merely an inconvenience, a lack of an impartial judge, you will prescribe a much milder cure. You will want a limited government. The purpose of this government is not to create rights, but to protect the natural rights you already had: life, liberty, and property. If that government oversteps its bounds and starts taking your rights, it has become the problem, and the people have the right to change it. This is the entire philosophical basis for the American Declaration of Independence. And if you are Rousseau, and you believe the disease is society itself, the inequality created by private property, then your cure will be far more radical. You will be deeply critical of existing governments, seeing them as systems that simply lock in and protect the powerful. You will advocate for a new kind of society that tries to recapture the freedom and equality we lost. Your view of human nature in a natural state determines what you believe the entire purpose of government is. So, we have these three visions: a horrific war, an inconvenient chaos, or a peaceful state corrupted by property. But in all three cases, for different reasons, humanity decides to leave this state of nature and form a society. They do this by making an agreement. They decide to trade some of their natural absolute freedom in exchange for the benefits of security, order, and cooperation. This great agreement, this voluntary pact among individuals to create a government and obey its laws, is perhaps the single most important concept in all of modern political thought. It is the solution to the problem of the state of nature. The social contract theory. In our previous lesson, we journeyed into the abstract world of the state of nature. We explored this powerful thought experiment, this what-if scenario. To understand what life might be like without any government, laws, or authority. We saw three very different visions: the terrifying war of all against all imagined by Thomas Hobbes, the inconvenient and unstable state of John Locke, where our natural rights were insecure, and the peaceful, solitary existence of Rousseau's noble savage, corrupted by the invention of private property. Though their starting points were different, all three philosophers concluded that human beings would, rationally and necessarily, choose to leave this state of nature. But how? By what mechanism is government created? This is the question we will answer in tonight's lesson. We will explore perhaps the most powerful and influential idea in all of modern political thought, the theory of the social contract. What is a social contract? At its very heart, it is an agreement. It is a pact, either real or hypothetical, among individuals to form a community and establish a government. Like any contract, it involves an exchange. It has terms and conditions. The people, who in the state of nature are completely free and independent, agree to voluntarily surrender some of their natural freedom. They agree to give up their right to do whatever they please, and to submit themselves to a central authority, to a set of laws, and to the will of the group. In exchange for this surrender of perfect liberty, they receive something they value even more: security. They receive the protection of an organized society. They get order, safety, the impartial judgment of a court, and the ability to live their lives without the constant fear or inconvenience that defined the state of nature. Let us use a simple analogy. Think of a business contract. Two parties sign a document. One party agrees to perform a service, and the other agrees to pay for it. Both sides give up something. The first gives up their time and labor, the second gives up their money, but both gain something they want more. The social contract is the grandest version of this. The citizens agree to pay their taxes and obey the laws. This is their side of the bargain. The state, in return, agrees to provide services, to create roads, to establish police for safety, to raise an army for national defense, and to run courts to settle disputes fairly. It is important to understand that for most philosophers, this was not a literal historical event. They did not imagine that, long ago, a group of people actually gathered in a field to sign a document. Rather, the social contract is a rational justification for the state's authority. It is a way of thinking about government that demonstrates why its power is legitimate. It argues that a rational person would consent to such an agreement, and that by living within a state's borders and enjoying its protection, we give our implicit consent to its terms. If you are still awake, just consider that for a moment. By simply living in a society, by using its roads and being protected by its laws, you are participating in an implied agreement. You are a party to this social contract. Now, just as the philosophers had different ideas about the disease of the state of nature, they also had very different ideas about the terms of the cure. The terms of the social contract vary dramatically. Let us return to Thomas Hobbes. His state of nature was a living hell, a war of all against all. The disease was fatal, therefore the cure had to be absolute. For Hobbes, the social contract is a desperate act of collective self-preservation. The people, terrified of violent death, gather together and agree to give up all of their rights and freedoms. They surrender their power absolutely and irreversibly to a single, all-powerful sovereign, a king or a monarch, or even an assembly which Hobbes called the Leviathan, after a great sea monster from the Bible. This Leviathan, this sovereign, is not a party to the contract. The people make the agreement with each other to obey the sovereign. The sovereign itself makes no promises and is above the law. Its power is total. For Hobbes, this is the only way to guarantee peace. The people have no right to rebel, no right to complain, because any government, even a deeply tyrannical one, is better than the alternative, the nasty, brutish, and short life in the state of nature. The purpose of this contract is one thing, and one thing only: security. Now, let us turn to John Locke. His vision could not be more different. Recall that for Locke, the state of nature was merely inconvenient. People already had natural rights to life, liberty, and property. They were not at war, they just needed a neutral judge. Therefore, Locke's social contract is not a desperate surrender, it is a smart, limited agreement. The people do not give up all their rights. In fact, they give up only one: the right to be their own judge and to personally punish those who wrong them. They hand this single right over to the community, which creates a government to act as an impartial referee. The entire purpose of this government, this referee, is to protect the rights to life, liberty, and property that the people retained. This is a crucial point. The government is created to serve the people and protect their rights. Because of this, the government is a party to the contract. It has a job to do. And if the government breaks the contract, if it stops protecting your rights, or, even worse, if it starts violating your rights, if it tries to take your property, or your life, or your liberty without due process, then the government has broken the agreement. The contract is now void. The people are released from their obligation to obey, and, most importantly, they gain a right to revolution, a right to create a new government that will fulfill its end of the bargain. This idea, the idea that government is limited, that it exists by consent, and that it can be overthrown if it becomes a tyranny, is one of the most powerful ideas in human history. This is not just abstract theory. The social contract, especially Locke's version, is the intellectual bedrock of all modern democracy. If you have ever read the United States Declaration of Independence, you have read a pure, perfect expression of John Locke's social contract theory. When Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happinesses, that is Locke's state of nature and natural rights." When he continued that, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is the social contract. And when he concluded that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, that is Locke's right to revolution. In many ways, a written constitution is the closest thing humanity has ever come to a literal, physical, social contract. It is the document. It is the agreement that outlines the terms. It states what the government's powers are, what its limits are, and what rights the people, the other party to the contract, hold sacred. Every time you vote, every time you pay your taxes, every time you appeal to the Constitution for your rights, you are actively reaffirming your role in this social contract. You are participating in the idea that government is not a divine right, but a human invention created by we the people for a specific, limited, and rational purpose. So, we have now established why a state exists to save us from the chaos and inefficiency of the state of nature. And we have established how a state is created through the rational agreement of the social contract, where we consent to be governed. This brings us to our next, and perhaps most important, line of inquiry. Now that this state exists, now that this powerful Leviathan, or this limited government, has been formed, What is its primary goal? What should it be doing? Many philosophers, stretching all the way back to the ancient world, would argue that the purpose of the state is not just order, but a higher ideal. They would argue that the goal of a good government is to establish justice. But what is justice? This is one of the oldest and most contested questions in all of philosophy. In our next lesson, we will begin our long exploration of this complex idea. We will travel back in time to ancient Athens to sit with Plato and explore his classical theory of justice as harmony, as laid out in his masterpiece, The Republic. Classical theories of justice, Plato's Republic. In our previous lessons, we established why the state exists as a rational escape from the state of nature, and we explored how it is formed through the mechanism of the social contract. We now arrive at one of the most important questions in all of philosophy. Now that this state has been created, what is its ultimate goal? What is the purpose of this government we have consented to? For many, the answer is not simply order or security. The answer is something higher. It is justice. The goal of a good, legitimate state is to be a just state. But what is justice? This single question is so vast, it has occupied thinkers for millennia. It is a word we all use, but it is incredibly difficult to define. Does it mean fairness? Does it mean equality? Does it mean people getting what they deserve? To begin our long investigation into this idea, we must travel back in time. We return to the very beginning of our philosophical tradition, to ancient Athens, and to the figure who casts the longest shadow over all of Western thought, Plato. In this lesson, we will explore the classical theory of justice as he presented it in his most famous and influential work, The Republic. When Plato set out to define justice, he faced an immediate problem. Justice is an abstract idea. It is a virtue of the human soul, and the soul is invisible. To solve this, Plato, through his teacher Socrates in the dialogue, proposes a brilliant method. He says, "Let us not try to find justice in the small, invisible soul first. Let us, instead, build a city in speech. Let us design a perfectly just city, a polis, from the ground up." He argues that the city is simply the soul writ large. By seeing justice in the large, visible structure of a city, we will be able to see, as if through a magnifying glass, what justice must be in the individual. So, Plato begins to build his ideal city. He argues that a city comes into being because we are not self-sufficient. We need each other for food, for shelter, for clothing. This leads to a division of labor. As the city grows, Plato argues it will naturally divide into three distinct classes based on the natural aptitudes of its citizens. First, there is the largest class, the producers. These are the farmers, the craftsmen, the merchants. They are the people who are best suited to create the goods and wealth that the city needs to survive. The primary virtue of this class, Plato says, is temperance or moderation. They must agree to be ruled. Second, the city needs defenders. This is the class of the auxiliaries, or the soldiers. These are the citizens who are naturally brave, spirited, and strong. Their job is to protect the city from external enemies and to keep order within. Their primary virtue is courage. Third, the city needs rulers. This, for Plato, is the smallest and most important class, the guardians. These are the individuals who are, by nature, the most rational, the most thoughtful, and who possess the greatest wisdom. Their job is to rule the city, not for their own benefit, but for the good of the whole. Their primary virtue is wisdom. Now, Plato asks, where is justice in this city we have built? He concludes that justice is not a fourth virtue, but rather the ordering principle of the whole. Justice, for Plato, is harmony. It is the principle that each part of the city is minding its own business. Justice is the condition where the producers produce, the auxiliaries defend, and the guardians rule. When no class tries to overstep its bounds, when the soldier does not try to make money, and the merchant does not try to make laws, the city is in perfect harmony. That harmony is justice. Having found justice in the city, Plato now applies this back to the individual soul. He argues the human soul also has three parts. First, appetite, our desires for food, drink, money, and material things. This corresponds to the producer class. Second, spirit, our sense of honor, our courage, our anger, and our pride. This corresponds to the auxiliary class. And third, reason, our capacity for rational thought, for logic, and for seeking truth. This corresponds to the guardian class. A just person, therefore, is one whose soul is in harmony. A just person is one in whom reason rules, using spirit as its ally to guide and control the appetites. An unjust person is one whose soul is in chaos, one who is ruled by their appetites, by their greed, or by their anger. Justice, then, is the internal harmony and health of the soul. Let this concept settle in your mind. Plato's vision of justice is one of order, hierarchy, and function. This is a meritocratic vision, not an egalitarian one. Plato did not believe all people are equal in their aptitudes. He believed a just city is one where the wise rule the brave and both rule the producers. Equality, for him, would be unjust, as it would be like letting the appetite part of the soul make decisions for the reason part. This leads to his most famous and most controversial idea, the philosopher king. Plato argues that the only people fit to be guardians, the only ones fit to rule, are philosophers. But he means something very specific by this. He does not mean academics. He means those who have, through decades of rigorous training, turned their minds away from the shadows of this world and grasped the ultimate truth, what he called the form of the good. In his Allegory of the Cave, he describes ordinary people as prisoners chained in a cave, watching shadows on a wall, mistaking them for reality. The philosopher is the prisoner who breaks free, climbs into the sunlight, and sees the real objects that were casting the shadows. This vision of truth and goodness is so overwhelming that the philosopher has no more desire for worldly things like power or money. In fact, they would rather stay in the light. But, Plato says, it is their duty to go back down into the cave and rule. They are the only ones fit to rule precisely because they do not want to. They will rule not for their own gain, but for the good of all, guided by their knowledge of truth. This vision also explains Plato's famous critique of democracy. Remember, as we discussed in our first lesson, Plato's teacher, Socrates, was legally tried and executed by the democracy of Athens. Plato saw this as the ultimate example of an unjust state, a state ruled by its appetite. He saw democracy as chaos, where the uneducated masses, the producer part of the city, are swayed by emotional speeches and short-term desires, leading the entire ship of state to ruin. For Plato, democracy was a mob, just as an unjust man is a mob of his own desires. 5. Real-world relevance and synthesis. Now, it is clear that Plato's vision of justice is very different from our modern one. Our entire political world is built on the ideas of democracy, equality, and individual rights, all things Plato rejected. And yet, his ideas have never left us. Plato's questions and his challenges are still incredibly relevant. When we, in our modern world, argue that our leaders should be wise, that they should be virtuous, that they should be educated and not just popular, we are echoing Plato. We are expressing a desire for a guardian class. When we talk about the idea of a meritocracy, the idea that people should get jobs and have influence based on their ability and talent, not just their wealth or family name, we are using a Platonic concept. The idea that a functional society depends on its citizens contributing in the ways they are best suited is a core part of his vision. And his critique of democracy is perhaps more relevant today than ever. When we worry about populism, or the spread of misinformation on social media, or the danger of an uninformed public making rash decisions, we are repeating the very same fears that Plato had about the Athenian mob. We are worrying about what happens when the appetite of the state is in charge, without the guidance of reason. Plato has given us our first powerful definition of justice. Justice is harmony. It is a hierarchical, meritocratic pattern for society, where everyone is in their proper place. But this pattern is deeply, profoundly unequal. And for the modern world, for a world built on the idea that all men are created equal, this is a deeply unsatisfying answer. This leads us to the great modern challenge. If we reject Plato's natural hierarchy, if we accept the fundamental moral equality of all citizens, how can we then create a just society? What is a fair pattern of distribution of wealth, of rights, of opportunities for a society of equals? This is the question that animated the 20th century, and it leads us directly to our next lesson. We will now leap forward over 2,000 years to explore the most important modern theory of justice, a theory built not on hierarchy, but on fairness. We will explore the work of the American philosopher John Rawls. Modern theories of justice, John Rawls and fairness. In our last lesson, we traveled back to ancient Athens to explore Plato's definition of justice. We found a vision of a perfectly ordered, harmonious, and hierarchical society. It was a vision of justice as harmony, where everyone had a specific function and place, all ruled by the wisdom of philosopher kings. This vision, however, is profoundly and intentionally unequal. It is built on the idea that people are not born equal in their capacities or their right to rule. We now leap forward over 2,000 years into a world that has been completely reshaped by a single revolutionary idea, the idea of fundamental human equality. We live in a world that presumes all citizens are morally equal, that all possess basic rights, and that government must be by the consent of the governed. This creates a new and much more difficult question. If we are all equals, what is a just society? What is a fair way to distribute wealth, power, and opportunity among a society of equals? This is the great question of modern political philosophy. And in the 20th century, one American philosopher provided the most powerful and influential answer. His name was John Rawls. In this lesson, we will explore his groundbreaking theory of justice as fairness. Let your mind be open as we explore this new thought experiment. Like Hobbes and Locke before him, John Rawls asks us to engage in a thought experiment. He does not use the state of nature, which he felt was too simplistic. Instead, he creates a new scenario, one designed specifically for the question of justice. He calls it the original position. Imagine, he says, that everyone who will be a member of a new society is gathered together for a single, momentous purpose: to choose the fundamental principles, the basic rules, that will govern this society forever. This is the original position. But, Rawls notes, if we all gathered to do this in real life, it would be a failure. Why? Because we would all argue from our own self-interest. The rich would argue for lower taxes. The poor would argue for more welfare. The talented would argue for a pure meritocracy. The religious would argue for laws favoring their faith. The meeting would collapse into a battle of competing interests. So, Rawls adds a crucial, ingenious element. He says that when we meet in this original position, we are all placed behind a veil of ignorance. This veil of ignorance is a conceptual blindfold. It makes you temporarily unaware of all the specific facts about who you are. Behind this veil, you do not know your class or social status. You do not know if you will be rich or poor. You do not know your natural talents, whether you will be intelligent, strong, or artistically gifted. You do not know your race, your gender, or your ethnicity. You do not even know your own conception of the good, that is, you do not know your own religion, your life goals, or your personal philosophy. You know only general facts about human society. You know that there will be a scarcity of resources and that people will have different goals, but you know nothing about yourself. From this position of pure impartial fairness, what rules would you agree to? Rules provides a simple, brilliant analogy. It is like you are the person chosen to cut a cake for a large group, but with one condition: you do not know which piece you will get. You might get the first piece, you might get the last, you might get a tiny sliver. What will you do? You will, of course, cut every single piece as fairly and as equally as you possibly can. You do this to protect yourself from your own uncertainty. The veil of ignorance works the same way. Since you do not know if you will be at the top or the very bottom of the society you are designing, you will create the fairest possible rules. You will design a system that you would be willing to live in, no matter where you ended up. So, Rawls asks, what principles would we actually choose from behind this veil? First, he argues, we would not choose pure utilitarianism, the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. Why? Because utilitarianism allows for the sacrifice of a minority for the sake of the majority. It could justify slavery, for example, if it made the rest of society tremendously happy and prosperous. Behind the veil, you do not know if you will be part of that sacrificed minority. The risk is too great. You would never agree to a system that could potentially leave you utterly crushed. Instead, Rawls argues we would agree, unanimously, on two fundamental principles of justice. The first principle is the liberty principle. This would be our top priority. We would agree that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. These are the non-negotiables: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience and religion, the right to vote, the right to hold office, the right to a fair trial. We would demand these first, before anything else. We would do this because we would not be willing to trade our basic freedoms for any amount of money. We would not, for example, agree to be a rich slave. So, we secure maximum, equal liberty for all. The second principle is the one that deals with social and economic inequalities. This part is crucial. Rawls is not a communist. He does believe some inequality is acceptable, but it is only acceptable if it meets two strict conditions. The first condition is fair equality of opportunity. This means that any inequalities must be attached to offices and positions open to all. This is not just formal equality, like a sign that says everyone can apply. It is fair equality. This means society must actively work to remove barriers. For example, a talented child from a poor neighborhood must have just as real a chance to become a doctor as a talented child from a wealthy one. The second, and most famous, condition is the difference principle. This states that social and economic inequalities are only to be permitted if they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Let this idea settle. What does it mean? It means we would allow a surgeon to earn more money than a janitor. Why? Because that extra income, the incentive, encourages people to go through a decade of difficult medical training. That incentive structure produces a society that has skilled surgeons, which is a system that benefits everyone, including the least advantaged person who may need surgery. But we would only allow inequalities that work to raise the floor. When choosing between different economic systems, we would not choose the one with the richest billionaires. We would, as if cutting the cake, choose the system where the poorest person is best off. It is a maximin strategy. We maximize the minimum position. Rawls's theory of justice as fairness is not just an abstract game. It is the most powerful philosophical justification for the modern, liberal, social welfare state. The liberty principle is the entire purpose behind a Bill of Rights or a written constitution that places individual rights beyond the reach of a majority vote. And the difference principle provides the moral argument for a whole range of policies. It is the why behind progressive taxation, where we tax the wealthy at a higher rate. This is not seen as punishing success, but as a fair agreement we all would have made from the original position to use the fruits of that success to benefit the least well-off. It is the justification for social safety nets. Public education, government-subsidized healthcare, unemployment benefits, food assistance, these are all real-world applications of the difference principle. They are society's way of honoring the contract, of ensuring that the least advantaged are cared for and that the floor of society is as high as it can possibly be. Rawls gives us a way to balance the two great values of modern life, liberty and equality. He says, we get both. We get maximum liberty, and then we arrange the economic system so that any inequalities must work to the advantage of everyone, especially those at the bottom. Rawls has given us a powerful, elegant theory. It is what we call a patterned theory of justice. It says, a just society is one where the pattern of wealth and income meets a specific requirement that it benefits the least advantaged. But this theory immediately invites a powerful criticism. What if the pattern doesn't matter at all? What if the only thing that matters is how people got what they have? What if justice is not about a fair outcome, but about fair rules and a fair process? This critique argues that as long as you acquired your property without stealing it, and people voluntarily paid you for it, then it is yours. And for the government to take it, even to help the poor, is a violation of your rights. This is the core argument of a completely different political philosophy, one that directly challenges Rawls. In our next lesson, we will explore this philosophy of absolute individual rights and the minimal state. We will examine the philosophy of libertarianism, as championed by Rawls's greatest contemporary rival, Robert Nozick. Libertarianism, Robert Nozick, and entitlement. In our previous lesson, we explored the powerful and elegant theory of John Rawls. He gave us a vision of justice as fairness, a society that we would all agree to from behind a veil of ignorance. It is a theory that defines a pattern for a just society, a pattern where all inequalities must be arranged to provide the greatest possible benefit to the very least well-off. This idea is compelling, but it did not go unchallenged. It immediately invited a profound critique. What if, this critique asks, justice is not about any final pattern at all? What if a just society is not a photograph, but a movie? What if justice lies not in the outcome, but entirely in the process? This is the central claim of a rival political philosophy, one that champions the individual, their rights, and their freedoms above all else. In this lesson, we will explore the philosophy of libertarianism, focusing on the work of its most brilliant academic defender and Rawls's greatest contemporary, Robert Nozick. Libertarianism is a philosophy that begins and ends with one central sacred value, individual liberty. It views human beings as ends in themselves, as sovereign individuals who own themselves. This concept of self-ownership is the bedrock of all libertarian thought. You own your body, you own your mind, you own your labor, and, by extension, you own the fruits of your labor, your property. Because you are your own master, any attempt by others, especially the government, to force you to do something against your will is a profound moral violation. It is a violation of your self-ownership. From this single premise, the entire libertarian vision of government flows. The only legitimate form of government is a minimal state, often called a night watchman state. Let this idea settle in. A night watchman state. What does a night watchman do? They patrol, they protect against intruders, and they keep the peace. They do not tell you how to live your life. They do not rearrange your furniture. They do not take your property to give to your neighbor. In the same way, the minimal state has only three legitimate and very narrow functions. First, to protect its citizens from force and violence through a police force. Second, to protect its citizens from theft and fraud through a court system. And third, to enforce voluntary contracts between individuals. That is all. Any government action that goes beyond these minimal functions is considered illegitimate. This means that for a libertarian, most of what modern governments do is a form of theft. Government taxation to pay for things like public schools, public parks, roads, social safety nets, healthcare, or scientific research is seen as a moral wrong. It is the government forcibly taking your property, the fruits of your labor, to pay for a service you may not have wanted or agreed to. This is seen as a fundamental violation of your liberty. In 1974, just 3 years after John Rawls published his theory, a young Harvard colleague named Robert Nozick published a direct and devastating response. His book was titled Anarchy, State, and Utopia. It remains the most important and sophisticated defense of libertarianism ever written. Nozick agreed with Rawls that we needed a thought experiment, but instead of the veil of ignorance, Nozick begins, like Locke, in a state of nature. He argues that a minimal night watchman state could arise from this state of nature without violating anyone's rights through a series of voluntary agreements. But the core of his book is his theory of justice, which he calls the entitlement theory. It is a direct assault on Rawls's pattern theory. Nozick argues that justice is not about a fair pattern of wealth. It is not about who has what. Justice, for Nozick, is historical and procedural. It is only about how people got what they have. If the process was just, the result is just, no matter how unequal that result may appear. His entitlement theory has 3 principles. First is justice in acquisition. This asks how a person can first come to own something that was previously unowned. He follows John Locke. You come to own a piece of unowned land by mixing your labor with it, as long as, in doing so, you leave enough and as good for others. Second is justice in transfer. This asks how property can justly change hands. The answer is simple. It must be a voluntary exchange. If you own something, you can sell it, you can trade it, or you can give it away as a gift or an inheritance. As long as both parties consent, the transfer is just. The third principle is the rectification of injustice. This simply states that if property was acquired unjustly, if it was stolen or taken by force or fraud, either recently or in the distant past, then that injustice must be corrected, perhaps by returning the property or paying compensation. That is the entire theory. For Nozick, if the chain of ownership is just, if the original acquisition was just, and every transfer since has been a voluntary exchange, then the resulting distribution of wealth is just. Period. It does not matter if one person ends up with millions of dollars and another ends up with nothing. Nozick uses a famous example to destroy the idea of patterned justice. He asks us to imagine our favorite pattern, let's say, a perfectly equal society. Now, he says, imagine a famous basketball player, Wilt Chamberlain. This player signs a contract with his team. The contract states that for every home game, a special box is set up. Fans who want to see him play must drop an extra 25 cents into this box, and that money goes directly to him. The fans voluntarily agree. They are happy to pay the extra quarter to see their favorite player. By the end of the season, Wilt Chamberlain has become fabulously wealthy, far richer than anyone else. The original equal pattern is completely destroyed. Nozick asks, what is unjust here? Did the fans not have a right to their own money? Did they not voluntarily choose to give it to him? Did Wilt Chamberlain not have a right to his own talent and labor? To restore the equal pattern, the government would have to come in and forcibly take Chamberlain's new wealth. This, Nozick says, is a constant interference in our free choices. Liberty, he famously wrote, upsets patterns. This leads to his most shocking claim. He argues that taxation for social programs is not just theft, it is, he says, morally equivalent to forced labor. Think about it, he argues. If the government taxes 30% of your income to give to the poor, what is it really doing? It is claiming that it has a right to 30% of your labor. It is forcing you, in effect, to work for 3 months of the year for someone else's benefit. Forcing someone to work for another's benefit is the very definition of forced labor. It is a form of partial slavery. It is a violation of the most fundamental right of all, self-ownership. This is not just an academic debate. Nozick's libertarian philosophy provides the moral and intellectual foundation for many of the most powerful political movements in the modern world. When you hear a politician argue for slashing income taxes, they are making a libertarian argument. They are standing on Nozick's premise that your income is your property, and that taking it is, at best, theft, and at worst, a form of servitude. When you hear arguments for the deregulation of industries or the privatization of public services like schools, post offices, or even roads, this is a libertarian argument. It is the belief that private, voluntary exchange in a free market is always more efficient and more moral than a government monopoly or service funded by coercive taxation. The entire philosophy of the free market is rooted in this idea of voluntary transfer. Libertarianism is the political expression of free market capitalism, which argues that a just society is one that protects property rights and then simply lets people trade, innovate, and live as they choose, without a central plan. We have now seen two powerful and completely opposed modern visions of justice. Rawls's vision of justice as fairness and Nozick's vision of justice as entitlement. The gulf between them seems impossible to bridge. But if you look closely, you will see that they are both arguing about the same word. They are both arguing for liberty, but they mean something completely different by it. Rawls is arguing for the value of liberty, that we need the actual resources and opportunities to be free. Nozick is arguing for the fact of liberty, that we must be free from any and all interference. This intense, focused debate on the meaning of freedom brings us to a crucial distinction in philosophy. It is a distinction that explains nearly all of our modern political disagreements. We must now pause and explore the two different ways we can understand the word liberty itself. In our next lesson, we will explore the famous essay by Isaiah Berlin as we discuss the two concepts of liberty. Isaiah Berlin, Two Concepts of Liberty. In our last two lessons, we have explored a deep and fundamental conflict at the heart of modern philosophy. We heard from John Rawls, who argues for a just society that arranges its structure to help the least well-off. And we heard from Robert Nozick, who argues that any such patterning is a violation of our rights, a form of forced labor. It is a powerful disagreement. Rawls's justice as fairness and Nozick's justice as entitlement seem to be two completely different, irreconcilable worlds. And yet, if you listen closely, you will hear that both men, with deep conviction, are arguing for the same thing. Both Rawls and Nozick are champions of liberty. How can this be? How can two brilliant thinkers, both starting from the value of human freedom, arrive at such opposite conclusions? The answer is that they are not, in fact, using the same definition of the word. The word freedom or liberty seems so simple, so self-evident, but it is, in reality, one of the most complex, contested, and dangerous words in all of politics. To understand the conflict between Rawls and Nozick, and, indeed, to understand almost all of our modern political debates, we must first pull this word apart. In this lesson, we will do just that. We will use the work of the 20th century philosopher Isaiah Berlin to distinguish between the two different and often competing concepts of liberty. In his landmark 1958 essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, Isaiah Berlin made a simple but profound distinction that clarified centuries of political argument. He separated liberty into two different types, which he called negative and positive. Let us first examine negative liberty. This is the first and, for many, the most classic understanding of freedom. Negative liberty is freedom from. It is freedom from external interference, from obstacles, from coercion by other people. It answers the simple question: what is the area within which I am left to do as I please without being stopped? Think of it as an empty space, a protected sphere around you. The larger this sphere, the more negative liberty you have. Every law the government passes, every rule, every tax is, from this perspective, a small reduction of that sphere. It is an interference. This is the kind of liberty that Robert Nozick and classical liberals like John Locke before him are dedicated to protecting. It is the freedom from being told what to do, from having your property taken, from being thrown in jail without cause. It is the absence of chains, the absence of a tyrant, the absence of interference. Now, let us turn to the second concept, positive liberty. This concept is more complex, but just as intuitive. Positive liberty is freedom to. It is not about the absence of external barriers, but about the presence of capacity and self-control. It is the freedom to be your own master, to act on your own rational will, and to realize your full human potential. It answers the question, who or what is the master of my actions? A person who is driven by an uncontrollable addiction, for example, might have perfect negative liberty. No one is forcing them to do anything, but they lack positive liberty because they are not their own master. They are a slave to their own impulses. But the concept extends much further. To truly be your own master, to be able to act on your free will, you need more than just an empty space. You need the capacity to act. You need education. You need your health. You need a basic level of resources to be able to make a meaningful choice in the first place. Let us use a clear analogy to lock this distinction in place. Imagine a person who is very poor. They have not eaten in 2 days. They walk past a bakery and see a loaf of bread. From the perspective of negative liberty, this person is perfectly free. There is no law that says they are not allowed to buy the bread. There is no police officer, no chain on the door, no one with a gun physically preventing them from walking in and making a purchase. Their sphere of non-interference is, in this specific instance, intact. But from the perspective of positive liberty, this person is profoundly unfree. They are a slave to their own poverty. They lack the capacity, the resources, the actual ability to fulfill their desire and their need. Their poverty is a barrier, just as real and just as powerful as a chain on the door. They have the freedom from being stopped, but they do not have the freedom to actually eat. This distinction is the key that unlocks the entire Rawls-Nozick debate. Nozick is the ultimate champion of negative liberty. He is building a fortress around your sphere of non-interference. Rawls, on the other hand, sees that negative liberty by itself is not enough. He argues that for your basic negative liberties like your freedom of speech or your right to vote to have any value, you must also have a basic level of positive liberty. What good is your freedom of speech if you are uneducated and cannot formulate an argument? What good is your right to vote if you are so sick you cannot make it to the polls? Rawls's difference principle, therefore, is a powerful argument for a foundation of positive liberty, a foundation of resources and opportunities that makes all the other liberties meaningful. If you are still awake, let this next point settle in. While Isaiah Berlin defined both concepts, he also issued a powerful and chilling warning. He was a man who had lived through the 20th century. He had watched the rise of Nazism and Stalinism, and he warned that the idea of positive liberty, while appealing, is historically the most dangerous idea in all of politics. Why? Because it can be so easily twisted. It begins with the idea of a higher self. A leader, a party, or a tyrant can claim that they know what your true, rational, or real self wants, even if your lower, emotional, or uneducated self does not realize it. They can say, "You think you want freedom of speech, but your higher self truly wants to serve the glory of the state." Or, "You think you want to be left alone, but your true self will only be liberated by following the rules of our party." This, Berlin warned, allows for a monstrous impersonation. It allows a tyrant to force you to be free. They can liberate you from your false consciousness by imprisoning you. They can liberate you from your irrational desires by re-educating you. In the name of a higher, positive freedom, they can justify the complete destruction of all your actual negative freedoms. This twisting of language, war is peace, freedom is slavery, was, for Berlin, the great philosophical disease of his time. This is not just an academic debate. This is the central argument that defines the entire left-right political spectrum in almost every modern democracy. When you hear a politician or a political party argue for lower taxes, fewer regulations on business, and getting government off our backs, you are hearing an argument for negative liberty. The core message is, stop interfering. It is a message that resonates with the part of us that wants to be our own boss, to be left alone, and to be protected from coercion. This is the language of Robert Nozick and the libertarian tradition. When you hear a different politician or party argue for public education, universal healthcare, environmental protections, or a stronger social safety net, you are hearing an argument for positive liberty. The core message is, give people the capacity to succeed. It is a message that resonates with the part of us that believes in fairness, that believes a child born in poverty deserves a real chance to achieve their potential. This is the language of John Rawls. This is why both sides can, with complete sincerity, claim to be the party of freedom. They are not lying, they are simply speaking two different dialects of the same language. They are prioritizing two different, and often competing, concepts of liberty. The fundamental challenge of a modern, stable society is to find a way to balance them both. So, we have now defined the state, seeing it as a product of a social contract. We have explored the deep question of justice, contrasting Rawls's fair patterns with Nozick's just processes. And now, we have clarified the fundamental value they are both fighting over, the two-sided coin of liberty. These grand ideas of justice, of liberty, of the state, do not just float in the abstract. They are bundled together into coherent, functioning systems of government. The most widespread and successful system our world has ever known is one that explicitly tries to manage these very tensions. It is a system built on the idea that the people themselves should decide how to balance the demands of negative and positive liberty. In our next lesson, we will turn our attention to the form and function of this system. We will explore the foundations of democracy. Foundations of democracy. In our recent lessons, we have been exploring the great grand theories of the state. We have wrestled with the profound questions of justice, contrasting the fair patterns of John Rawls with the just processes of Robert Nozick. We then uncovered the fundamental disagreement at their core, the two competing concepts of liberty, negative freedom from interference, and positive freedom to achieve one's potential. These are not just abstract debates, these tensions are real. Every society must find a way to manage them. And for the last several centuries, the most widespread, powerful, and successful system for managing these exact conflicts has been the one known as democracy. In this lesson, we will turn our attention from the abstract why of the state to the practical how. We will explore the foundations of this form of government, what it means, what it values, and the profound dangers it must guard against. The word democracy itself comes to us from the ancient Greeks, the same culture that gave us Plato. It is a compound of two Greek words, demos, meaning the common people, and kratos, meaning rule or power. So, at its absolute core, democracy simply means rule by the people. It is a system of government where the ultimate political authority is vested in the citizens themselves. This is a radical idea. It rejects the authority of a king based on tradition, the authority of a conqueror based on power, and the authority of a priest based on divine right. In a democracy, The only legitimate source of authority is the consent of the governed, as John Locke proposed in his social contract. When we speak of democracy, we must first distinguish between its two primary forms. The first is direct democracy. This is the form practiced in ancient Athens, the birthplace of the word. In a direct democracy, there are no elected officials in the way we think of them. Instead, all eligible citizens gather together in one place, the assembly, to debate and vote directly on every single law. If a law is proposed to build a new wall, the citizens themselves vote yes or no. If the city must decide on war or peace, the citizens themselves make the final decision. This system is very pure, but as you can imagine, it is only practical in a very small community, like an ancient city-state or a small town meeting. It is simply impossible to gather 50 million citizens in one place to debate a tax code. This is why, in the modern world, the second form is dominant, representative democracy. This is the system you almost certainly live under. In a representative democracy, the citizens do not rule directly. Instead, they exercise their power indirectly. They vote to elect officials, presidents, prime ministers, senators, members of parliament, who are then entrusted to go to the capital city and make laws on their behalf. The power still rests with the people, who can vote these representatives out of office in the next election if they are displeased. This system allows democracy to function over a vast, complex nation of millions. Why has this system become so valued? What, at its core, is the moral argument for democracy? The value of democracy rests on two powerful pillars: autonomy and equality. First, autonomy. This is the idea of self-rule. Democracy is the only system that allows a people to be autonomous, to be the authors of their own laws. Even if you vote for the losing side, you have participated in the process. You are obeying laws that you, as part of the collective people, have had a voice in creating. This is a profound expression of political liberty. Second, equality. Democracy is built on the principle of political equality, most famously expressed in the phrase, "one person, one vote." It does not matter if you are rich or poor, educated or uneducated, a farmer or a CEO. In the voting booth, your voice, your power, is precisely equal to that of every other citizen. Your wealth or status does not give you more votes. But this very strength, this commitment to the rule of the people or the will of the majority, also creates democracy's single greatest and most dangerous weakness. Let this concept settle into your mind. What happens when the majority is wrong? What happens when the majority is cruel? This is the classic, terrifying problem known as the tyranny of the majority. Plato, as we learned, was democracy's first great critic. He feared that the many, the uneducated, emotional appetite part of the state, would vote out of envy or ignorance. He feared they would vote to steal the property of the rich, or be swayed by a smooth-talking demagogue who would lead them to ruin. This fear was echoed thousands of years later by the French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville. In the 1830 seconds, he traveled across the United States, which was then the world's great democratic experiment. He admired its energy and its equality, but he also came away with a deep, profound warning. He warned of a new kind of despotism. He feared that in a society where the majority is all-powerful, it would create a suffocating social pressure. More to the point, he feared that a 51% majority could use the power of the law to legally and democratically oppress the 49% minority. What is to stop a 51% majority from voting to outlaw the religion of the 49%? What is to stop them from voting to take away the property or the freedom of speech of those who disagree with them? If democracy is just rule by the majority, then it can be just as tyrannical as any king. This brings us to the most important point of this lesson, this danger. The tyranny of the majority is why most modern democracies are not pure democracies. Instead, they are what we call liberal democracies or constitutional republics. The United States, for example, is not a pure democracy. It is a constitutional republic. This is a crucial distinction. What is the difference? The difference is the Constitution. A constitution and its accompanying Bill of Rights is a document that is intentionally placed above the will of the majority. It is a set of fundamental rules, a set of sacred limits that everyone must obey, even the government and even a 99% majority. This is the brilliant solution to Plato's and de Tocqueville's problem. In a pure democracy, if 51% of the people vote to ban a certain book, that book is banned. The will of the majority is law. In a constitutional republic, if 51% of the people vote to ban that same book, the law is struck down. Why? Because the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, is in the Constitution. It is a right that is protected from the majority. The 51% cannot vote away the rights of the 49%. This is what the liberal part of liberal democracy means. It means it is a democracy that is limited by a deep commitment to liberalism, to the protection of individual rights, the rule of law, and the protection of minorities. We have just used that essential phrase, liberal democracy. It is the phrase that best describes the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and so many others. And as we have just seen, this phrase is a combination of two distinct, powerful ideas. We have now spent this lesson exploring the first half of that phrase, democracy, the idea of rule by the people. We understand its value, its forms, and its great inherent danger. This now brings us, logically and necessarily, to the second half of that phrase. What, precisely, is this liberalism? What is this philosophy that is so important? It is used as a limit on democracy itself. In our next lesson, we will explore the philosophy that places the individual, their rights, and their liberty at the very center of the political universe. We will explore the deep and powerful foundations of liberalism. The philosophy of liberalism. In our last lesson, we explored the foundations of democracy, the rule by the people. We saw its power, which is rooted in the values of autonomy and equality, but we also saw its great, inherent danger, the tyranny of the majority. This led us to a crucial term, the one that describes most modern Western governments, liberal democracy. We have now examined the democracy half of that phrase. We must now turn with equal focus to the liberal half. What is this liberalism? What is this philosophy that is so powerful, so fundamental, that we use it as the very limit on democratic rule? In this lesson, we will explore the foundations of liberalism, the philosophy that placed the individual and their rights at the very center of the political universe. Let your mind relax as we investigate this powerful idea. At its very heart, liberalism is a political philosophy founded on the supreme value of the individual. This may sound simple, but it is perhaps the most revolutionary idea in political history. For all the centuries that came before, political thought was centered on the group, the tribe, the kingdom, the church, or the state. The individual was seen as a subject, a person who belonged to a king or who existed to serve the glory of God or the power of the state. Liberalism, which began to emerge in the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, completely inverted this. It began with the radical premise that the individual is sovereign. You are not a subject of the state is a servant to you. From this central trunk, all the branches of liberalism grow. Its core components are, first, liberty. Liberals believe that all individuals are born free and should have the right to live their lives as they choose, as long as they do not harm others. Second, equality. Liberalism does not argue that all people are equal in talent or wealth, but that they are born with equal moral worth. Because of this, they must be treated equally before the law. The law must be blind to who you are. Third, consent of the governed. This is the social contract we have already discussed. Liberalism argues that the only legitimate government is one that the people have agreed to create. Authority comes from below, from the people, not from above, from a king or a god. To protect these values, liberalism insists on two critical structures. The first is the rule of law. This is the idea that no one is above the law. Not a king, not a president, not a billionaire, not a police officer. The laws, clear and publicly known, apply to everyone equally. This is the great wall that protects the individual from the arbitrary power of a tyrant. The second structure is limited government. Because liberals were historically suspicious of concentrated power, they argued that the government's powers must be restricted or limited, often by a written constitution. This is why we have concepts like the separation of powers dividing government into branches that can check each other and, most importantly, a Bill of Rights. As this powerful philosophy grew, it branched into two major streams. It is essential to understand both, as their debate defines our political world today. The first stream is classical liberalism. This is the original form of liberalism, born in the Age of Revolution. Its intellectual father is John Locke, whom we have met. For Locke, the purpose of government was narrow and specific, to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Classical liberalism is, at its heart, a doctrine of negative liberty, freedom from. It is about getting the government and the church out of your life. The economic father of classical liberalism was the great Scottish philosopher Adam Smith. In his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that the economic expression of liberty is the free market. He argued that if you leave individuals free to pursue their own economic self-interest, an invisible hand will guide their actions to create the greatest possible wealth for society as a whole. This is the doctrine of laissez-faire, which means let it be. The government should enforce contracts, protect property, and then get out of the way. For centuries, this classical liberalism was a force for liberation, tearing down old monarchies and rigid economic controls. But by the 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution, a new set of problems emerged. The world saw child labor, dangerous factories, and massive, crushing urban poverty. This led to the rise of the second stream, modern liberalism, which is also called social liberalism. This new generation of thinkers did not reject classical liberalism, but sought to update it. The English philosopher John Stuart Mill was a key bridge. He was a passionate defender of individual liberty, especially freedom of speech. But he also argued that true freedom required some basic level of education and well-being. He introduced the harm principle, the idea that your freedom to act can be limited only when your actions cause direct harm to others. This simple principle opened the door for government to step in and regulate, for example, a factory that was polluting a town's water supply. By the 20th century, modern liberals, like our friend John Rawls, fully developed this idea. They argued that the old, classical, negative liberty was not enough. What good, they asked, is your freedom of speech if you are illiterate? What good is your right to vote if you are starving or sick? Modern liberalism, therefore, also champions positive liberty, the freedom to. It argues that for individuals to truly be free, to truly be their own masters, a just society must provide a foundation. This means the government has a positive role to play in providing public education, in regulating the economy to prevent crises, in providing a social safety net, and in ensuring healthcare. This is not seen as an attack on liberty, but as the necessary investment to make liberty meaningful for everyone, not just the lucky and the rich. You are now, at this moment, living in a world built almost entirely by this liberal philosophy. The United States Constitution is a profoundly liberal document. It is not, as we learned, a democratic document in the pure sense. It is a machine for limited government. The separation of powers, the checks and balances, and, most explicitly, the Bill of Rights, are all liberal inventions. The First Amendment does not say the majority shall decide on speech. It says Congress shall make no law. It is a powerful limit on the majority, designed to protect the individual. On a global scale, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations, is a pure expression of liberal philosophy. It lists the fundamental rights that belong to every individual, regardless of their race, their nation, or their religion. In fact, the entire mainstream political debate in the West is, for the most part, a debate within the liberal family. When you watch the news and see a debate between conservatives and liberals in the American sense of the words, you are not, for the most part, watching a debate between two different philosophies. You are watching a debate between classical liberalism, which today is often called conservatism, and modern social liberalism. One side, the classical side, is prioritizing negative liberty. It argues for lower taxes, fewer regulations, and a smaller government. The other side, the modern side, is prioritizing positive liberty. It argues for government investment in education, healthcare, and the environment. But both sides believe in the Constitution. Both sides believe in the rule of law. Both sides believe in free elections, freedom of speech, and the free market. They are simply arguing about where, on the spectrum of liberalism, to set the dial. For over 200 years, this liberal system, this combination of free market capitalism and individual rights, has become the most powerful and successful political and economic system on the planet. But it has never been without its critics. From the very beginning, from the first dark days of the Industrial Revolution, another philosophy rose up to challenge it. This challenger did not just want to tweak liberalism, it wanted to overthrow it. This philosophy argued that liberalism's focus on individual rights and private property was not a path to freedom at all. It was, instead, a sophisticated lie. It was a system designed to mask a new, brutal form of exploitation. In our next lesson, we will explore this powerful and persistent critique. We will examine the core ideas of socialism and its most influential and revolutionary form, Marxism. Critiques of liberalism, socialism, and Marxism. In our last lesson, we explored the foundations of liberalism, the philosophy that has defined the modern Western world. We saw its deep commitment to the individual, to the rule of law, to limited government, and to the free market capitalism that grew alongside it. This liberal system unleashed incredible productivity and created immense wealth. But as it spread during the Industrial Revolution, it also created new and terrible problems: vast urban poverty, dangerous factory conditions, and a staggering, the visible gap between the very rich and the very poor. In the face of this new reality, a powerful set of critiques emerged. These critiques argued that liberalism was not the end of history, and that its promise of freedom was, for the majority, an illusion. This broad family of critiques is known as socialism, and its most powerful, revolutionary, and influential form is Marxism. In this lesson, we will explore this great challenger to the liberal order. We will examine what socialism is, and then dive deep into the specific historical analysis of its most important philosopher, Karl Marx. Let us first define our terms, as they are often misunderstood. At its most fundamental level, socialism is a political and economic philosophy that advocates for the social ownership or democratic control of the means of production. This phrase, means of production, is key. It does not refer to your personal property, like your clothes, your toothbrush, or your home. It refers to the productive assets of society: the factories, the land, the machinery, the raw materials, and the major infrastructure that are used to create all other goods and wealth. Liberalism, and its economic system of capitalism, argues that these means of production should be privately owned. Socialism argues that they should be owned collectively, by the public, by the workers, or by the state on behalf of the people. Why? The socialist goal is to manage these productive assets for the common good of all, rather than for the private profit of a few owners. It is a philosophy that prioritizes values like community, equality, and cooperation, arguing that they are smothered by the capitalist focus on competition and individual self-interest. This broad idea has many different forms, but the most specific, most influential, and most world-changing version of socialism was developed in the 19th century by two German philosophers, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. This brings us to Marxism. Marxism is not just a vague desire for a nicer society. It is a detailed, systematic analysis of history and capitalism, one that claims to be scientific. Marx's method is called historical materialism. This is the idea that the engine of all human history is economic. The way a society produces and distributes its material goods, its economic base, determines everything else about that society: its government, its laws, its culture, its religions, and its philosophies, the superstructure. For Marx, all of history is the story of how these economic systems change, and he argued that they change through conflict, specifically a class struggle. In ancient Rome, it was the struggle between masters and slaves. In the feudal Middle Ages, it was the struggle between lords and serfs. And under capitalism, Marx argued, this great historical struggle has been simplified into its final, epic confrontation: the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. These two terms are central to Marx's entire critique. The bourgeoisie is the modern capitalist class, the ruling class. They are the ones who own the means of production, the factory owners, the bankers, the large landowners. The proletariat is the modern working class. They own nothing except for one single thing: their own labor power, which they are forced to sell to the capitalists in order to survive. According to Marx, the relationship between these two classes is not a fair, voluntary exchange, as liberals would claim. It is, by its very nature, a relationship of exploitation. Here is how his argument works. A worker is hired by a factory owner for a daily wage. Let us say that in the first 4 hours of their 10-hour workday, the worker creates enough value to cover the cost of their own wage. The rest of the day, the remaining 6 hours, the worker is laboring for free. This extra value they create is what Marx called surplus value. This surplus value is taken by the capitalist owner, and it is the entire source of their profit. For Marx, all profit, at its core, is the stolen, unpaid labor of the working class. This isn't just unfair, it is the hidden, essential engine of the entire capitalist system. But the critique went deeper. Marx argued that this system was not just exploitative, it was also profoundly alienating. He said capitalism alienated the worker in 4 ways. First, the worker is alienated from the product of their labor. They build a car, but they do not own it. Second, they are alienated from the act of labor itself. Their work is repetitive, mindless, and dictated by a machine, not by their own creativity. Third, they are alienated from their fellow workers, whom they are forced to see as competitors for jobs and wages. And finally, they are alienated from their own species being, their own human potential, their creativity, and their connection to nature. Marx was not just a critic, he believed he was also a prophet. He saw himself as a scientist who had discovered the laws of motion of capitalism. And these laws, he argued, led to its inevitable collapse. He predicted that capitalism, driven by competition, would centralize wealth into fewer and fewer hands. Small businesses would be crushed by giant monopolies. To maximize profits, capitalists would be forced to drive down wages and replace workers with machines. This would create an ever larger, ever poorer, and ever more miserable proletariat. Eventually, he argued, this massive working class would achieve class consciousness. They would realize their own exploitation and their own collective power. They would rise up in a global revolution, seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie, and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, a workers' state to dismantle the old system. This, Marx argued, would eventually wither away, leading to the final stage of human history, communism. This was Marx's utopia, a stateless, classless, moneyless society where all property is held in common, and the guiding principle is, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. It is impossible to overstate the impact of these ideas. Marx's philosophy, for better or worse, was arguably the single most influential political doctrine of the 20th century. It was the direct inspiration for the communist revolutions in Russia in 1917 and later in China, Cuba, Vietnam, and across Eastern Europe. These revolutionary states, like the Soviet Union, were the first attempts to build a society on Marxist principles, abolishing private property and creating a state-run command economy. However, it is a crucial distinction that not all socialism is revolutionary Marxism. Many who were inspired by Marx rejected his call for violent revolution. This led to the other major branch of socialism, democratic socialism. This is the philosophy that seeks to achieve socialist goals, such as the collective ownership of key industries like healthcare, energy, and education, and a massive redistribution of wealth by working within the existing liberal democratic system. Instead of overthrowing the government, they seek to win elections. This tradition is a major political force in many parts of the world, especially in Europe and Scandinavia. When you hear modern politicians in the United States or the United Kingdom use the term socialist, they are almost always referring to this democratic socialist tradition, not to revolutionary Marxism. They are not advocating for a Soviet-style dictatorship, but for policies like universal healthcare, free university tuition, and very high taxes on the wealthy to fund a powerful social safety net. They are, in effect, a modern socialist critique of the inequalities produced by modern liberalism. We have now explored the great ideological battle of the 20th century, the liberal, capitalist West, championed by thinkers like Locke and Rawls, versus the socialist and communist East, inspired by the powerful critique of Karl Marx. But as this great debate raged, another, more subtle critique was emerging. This critique looked at both liberalism and Marxism and found a common, unexamined flaw. It argued that all of these grand theories which spoke of man, the individual, the worker, and the citizen were, in fact, only talking about men. They were built on a foundation that ignored, dismissed, or rendered invisible the experiences of half of the human race. This new school of thought argued that all of traditional political philosophy, from Plato to Marx, had been gender blind. In our next lesson, we will explore this powerful and transformative critique. Feminist political philosophy. In our recent lessons, we have explored the great ideological battles of the modern age. We have contrasted the world of liberalism, built on the individual and the free market, with the powerful socialist critique championed by Karl Marx, which focuses on class struggle and exploitation. These two grand theories, liberalism and Marxism, dominated the 20th century. And yet, as they fought for a century over the soul of humanity, a different, more subtle, and perhaps more fundamental critique was emerging. This new school of thought looked at both of these great isms, and indeed, at the entire tradition of political philosophy, stretching all the way back to Plato, and it found a shocking, shared, and unexamined flaw. It argued that all of these theories, which spoke in universal terms of man, the citizen, the individual, or the worker, were, in fact, only talking about the experiences of men. In this lesson, we will explore this powerful and transformative critique. We will examine the core ideas of feminist political philosophy. What is feminist political philosophy? It is not, at its core, a single, unified ism like liberalism or Marxism. Rather, it is a diverse and wide-ranging field of inquiry. It is a way of rereading our entire philosophical tradition, but this time with a focus on a new question: gender. Its central task is to examine how our ideas about gender, about what it means to be a man or a woman, have silently but powerfully shaped all of our political concepts. It asks, how have assumptions about gender influenced our definitions of justice, power, liberty, and authority? And how has the entire history of philosophy rendered the experiences, perspectives, and problems of women invisible? This critique begins with one central, unifying concept. It is the most important concept for understanding feminist thought. It is the challenge to the public-private divide. Let this concept settle into your mind. What is this divide? From the very beginnings of philosophy, Western thinkers have split human life into two separate spheres. First, there is the public sphere. This is the world of the polis, as the Greeks called it. It is the world of politics, of law, of war, of business, of reason, and of citizenship. This sphere was seen as the only one that mattered for political philosophy, and, for all of history, it was a sphere inhabited almost exclusively by men. Second, there is the private sphere. This is the world of the oikos, the Greek word for household. This is the world of the family, of domestic life, of childbirth, of raising children, and of daily labor. This sphere was seen as natural, as pre-political, and therefore as unimportant to philosophy. And this sphere, of course, was the one to which women were relegated. Feminist political philosophy argues that this divide is the single most important tool that has been used to justify the exclusion and subordination of women. By declaring the private sphere non-political, philosophers were able to ignore all the power, domination, and injustice that happened within it. This critique that the private world of the family is not just natural, but is intensely political, is perhaps the central slogan of the feminist movement. The personal is political. This simple phrase means that things like housework, childcare, marriage, and sexuality are not just personal choices. They are, in fact, structured by systems of power, and they are fundamental to how our public, political world works. Let us look at how this critique plays out in practice. The first great wave of feminist thought, often called liberal feminism, did not try to destroy this divide, but to cross it. The English philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, writing in 1792, was a pioneer. In her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she argued against the thinkers of her day, like Rousseau, who said women were naturally emotional and incapable of reason. Wollstonecraft argued that women appeared inferior only because they were denied an education. She demanded that women be educated, not because they were identical to men, but so they could become rational individuals, good citizens, and true companions to their husbands, rather than just domestic servants or property. She was, in essence, arguing for women's entry into the public sphere as rational beings. But a more radical critique came later, in the 20th century, most famously from the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. In her 1949 masterpiece, The Second Sex, she took the critique to a much deeper level. She made the crucial distinction between biological sex and socially constructed gender. Her most famous sentence is, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." Her point is that society, from the moment of birth, teaches girls how to be women, to be passive, to be domestic, to be objects of beauty. It is a set of rules and expectations that are imposed upon them. De Beauvoir's central argument is that all of human history and thought has been built by men who have defined themselves as the default human being, the self, or the subject. Women, by contrast, have always been defined in relation to men. They are the other. They are not defined by who they are, but by how they differ from men. This, she argued, is the deepest form of oppression to be made into an object in a world of subjects. This philosophical critique that the personal is political is not just an academic theory. It is the intellectual engine that powered and continues to power some of the most profound political and legal changes in modern history. Think, for example, of the fight for women's suffrage, the right to vote. This was a direct, practical, and revolutionary assault on the public-private divide. It was the claim that women were not just private beings, but were public citizens, equal to men, with an equal right to participate in the polis. Think about our modern debates over reproductive rights. The arguments over contraception and abortion are perhaps the clearest possible example of the personal is political. They are about who controls the private realm of a woman's body, the individual, or the public power of the state. This philosophy also provided the language to talk about economic inequality. It allowed us to ask, why is the private work of childcare, domestic labor, or nursing work traditionally done by women so systematically undervalued and underpaid compared to the public work of finance or construction? The critique of the gender pay gap is a direct result of this philosophical unmasking. And finally, consider the law. For centuries, in many liberal countries, a husband could not be charged with raping his wife. Why? Because the marriage contract was seen as giving him permanent consent, and what happened in the bedroom was a private family matter outside the reach of the law. Similarly, domestic violence was treated as a private dispute for the police to ignore. It was feminist political philosophy that provided the arguments to shatter this private shield. It argued that violence is violence, that crime is crime, and that the public arm of the law must reach into the home to protect the rights of individuals. This philosophy, in short, redrew the very map of what we consider political. We have now explored the great critiques within the state. We have seen Marx's critique of class and the feminist critique of gender. These philosophies have challenged the internal structures of liberalism and democracy. But so far, every single one of our lessons, from Plato to Locke to Rawls to Marx, has taken one massive, unexamined concept for granted: the nation-state itself. All of our discussions of justice have stopped, as if at a wall, at the nation's border. But we live in a globalized world, a world of 8 billion people, a world of massive, staggering inequalities between countries, not just within them. This brings us to our next and final expansion of our moral vision. Does our obligation to justice stop at our border? What, if anything, does a wealthy citizen of a rich country owe to a starving person in a poor one? In our next lesson, we will ask this profound question. We will explore the field of global justice and the philosophy of cosmopolitanism. Global justice and cosmopolitanism. Throughout our long journey together, we have explored the great questions of our shared political life. We have traveled from Plato's ideal city to Locke's social contract. We have wrestled with Rawls's vision of fairness, Marx's critique of class, and the feminist unmasking of gender. But in all of these discussions, from the ancient Greeks to the modern critics, we have silently accepted one massive, unexamined assumption. We have assumed that the primary stage for all politics, for all questions of justice, is the nation-state. Our theories of justice have, in effect, stopped at the border, as if at a great wall. But we do not live in a world of isolated states. We live in a single, deeply interconnected, globalized world. A world of 8 billion people. A world defined by staggering, almost unimaginable inequalities between countries, not just within them. This brings us to our next and final expansion of our moral vision. Does our obligation to justice stop at our own border? What, if anything, does a person living in a wealthy, safe country owe to a person living in extreme poverty and danger on the other side of the planet? In this lesson, we will confront this profound question. we will explore the challenging field of global justice. The field of global justice asks us to apply our theories of fairness and morality, not just to our fellow citizens, but to all of humankind. It forces us to confront the most glaring fact of our modern world: the deep structural inequality between what is often called the global north, the wealthy, developed nations, and the global south, the poorer, developing nations. The central question of global justice is this massive gap where some are born into a world of clean water, abundant food, healthcare, and law, while others are born into a world of famine, preventable disease, and conflict. Is this a misfortune, or is it an injustice? A misfortune is like a natural disaster, an earthquake or a hurricane. It is tragic, but no one is to blame. It is just the way the world is. An injustice, on the other hand, is a moral wrong. It is a state of affairs that is unfair, that is caused by human systems, and that we have a moral duty to correct. On this question, political philosophy splits into two broad and opposing camps. The first camp is often called nationalism or statism. This is the view that you are, perhaps, most familiar with. It argues that our primary, and perhaps only, true moral duties are to our fellow citizens. We share a special bond with them. We share a government, a history, a culture, and a social contract. We pay taxes to support our poor, our sick, and our elderly. Our obligations to people in other countries are, from this view, much weaker. They are a matter of optional charity, but not a requirement of justice. The second camp, the great challenger to this view, is called cosmopolitanism. The word comes from the ancient Greeks, kosmos, meaning the world, and polites, meaning citizen. A cosmopolitan is, quite literally, a citizen of the world. Cosmopolitanism is the philosophical view that all human beings, regardless of their nationality, their race, their religion, or where they happen to be born, belong to a single, shared moral community. From this perspective, the borders that divide us into nations are, from a moral point of view, completely arbitrary. They are accidents of history, and we cannot let such a moral accident determine the entire life prospects of a human being. Let us explore this cosmopolitan argument, for it is one of the most demanding in all of philosophy. The cosmopolitan argument begins with a simple fact: where you are born is a matter of pure brute luck. You did not do anything to deserve to be born in a wealthy, safe country, just as a child in a war-torn famine region did not do anything to deserve their fate. It is a moral accident. This, you may notice, is very similar to John Rawls's veil of ignorance. A cosmopolitan might ask, if you were in the original position, behind that veil, and you did not know which country you would be born into, what kind of global system would you design? You would certainly not design the one we have now. You would design a system that offered a basic foundation of security and well-being for everyone, no matter where they were born. Perhaps the most famous and powerful argument for this position was made by the Australian philosopher Peter Singer. He presents a simple and devastating thought experiment. Imagine, he says, that you are walking to work. You are wearing a brand new, very expensive pair of shoes. You walk past a shallow pond. Suddenly, you see that a small child has fallen into the pond and is in danger of drowning. You are the only one around. You can easily wade in, pull the child to safety, and save their life. However, if you do this, you will completely ruin your expensive shoes and your suit, and you will be late for your meeting. What is your moral obligation? The answer, for every one of us, is immediate and obvious. You must save the child. The shoes, the suit, the meeting, they are all utterly trivial in comparison to a human life. To walk past, to let the child drown in order to protect your property, would be a monstrous moral failure. Now, Singer makes his crucial move. He argues that there is no moral difference between this child in the pond right in front of you and a child on the other side of the world who is dying right now from a preventable disease like malaria or from starvation. We know that organizations like UNICEF or Doctors Without Borders can, with a donation of a relatively small amount of money, the cost of a new pair of shoes, save the life of that child. Singer's point is that the distance does not matter. The nationality of the child does not matter. The fact that you are not the only one who can help does not matter. All that matters is the simple, brutal equation. A human life is at stake, and you can save it at a cost that is, by comparison, trivial. For a true cosmopolitan like Singer, giving to foreign aid is not charity. It is not a nice thing to do if you feel generous. It is your absolute, fundamental moral duty. To fail to give, when you have so much, is the moral equivalent of walking past that drowning child. This is not just an abstract philosophical game. This debate between the nationalist and the cosmopolitan is the central burning question at the heart of all of our most difficult global issues. Think about foreign aid. Is it, as the nationalist might argue, a form of optional generosity, a tool of foreign policy? Or is it, as the cosmopolitan argues, a fundamental moral duty, a matter of justice, a global redistribution of wealth that is no different from taxing the rich to help the poor within our own country? Think about the refugee crisis. What do wealthy, stable nations owe to people fleeing war, persecution, or climate-driven collapse? Does a nation have a right to close its borders, to protect its own culture and its own economy, as the nationalist view would imply? Or do we have a profound moral obligation to help these people, to see them not as foreigners, but as fellow human beings, as fellow citizens of the world whose rights are in peril? Consider the very idea of international human rights law. The concept that you have rights simply by being human, not by being a citizen of a specific country, is perhaps the single greatest, most practical victory of cosmopolitan philosophy. And finally, consider climate change. This is, perhaps, the ultimate global justice problem. The wealthy nations of the global north became wealthy by burning fossil fuels, producing the vast majority of historical emissions. But the worst consequences, the most severe droughts, the most powerful storms, the rising sea levels are being felt disproportionately by the poorest nations of the global south, the very nations that did the least to cause the problem. A nationalist might see this as a problem for each nation to solve on its own. A cosmopolitan sees it as a profound, staggering injustice. They would argue that the wealthy nations have a clear moral duty, a duty of justice, to lead the transition to green energy, and to pay to help the poorer nations adapt to the catastrophe that has been inflicted upon them. We have now completed our great expansion of our moral and political vision. We began with the individual soul in Plato's Athens. We built the state with Locke's contract. We challenged its structure with Marx's critique of class and the feminist critique of gender. And now, finally, we have dissolved the borders of that state to see the entire globe as a single community. We have explored the great theories. We have learned the language of justice, of liberty, of power. We have, in essence, been given the toolkit. This brings us to our final and most practical question. What do we do with this toolkit? Now that we have this knowledge, what is our role? What does it mean to be a citizen? In our concluding lesson, we will synthesize everything we have learned and reflect on the practical purpose of this entire journey, the true role of the citizen. Conclusion: the role of the citizen. And so, we arrive at our final lesson. In this concluding segment, we will bring our long journey to its close. We have traveled a great distance together, in our minds. We began with the individual, in the ancient city of Plato, searching for the nature of justice in the human soul. We then built the state itself, rising from a state of nature through the rational agreement of a social contract. We explored the great debates that define that state, the conflicts over justice between the patterns of Rawls and the processes of Nozick, the two faces of liberty, negative and positive. We then turned to the great critiques, hearing from Marx about the hidden struggles of class, and from feminist philosophy about the unexamined assumptions of gender. And finally, we expanded our vision to its widest possible lens, dissolving the borders of the nation to see the entire globe as a single moral community, facing the profound questions of global justice. We have now, in essence, built the entire edifice of political thought. We have examined its foundations, its rooms, its conflicts, and its critiques. This leaves us with only one final and intensely practical question. What do we do with this knowledge? Now that we have this toolkit, what is our role? In this last lesson, we will synthesize what we have learned and consider the true role of the citizen. What does it mean to be a citizen? In a simple dictatorship, the role of the inhabitant is simple. It is to be a subject. The subject's role is to obey, to be quiet, and to follow the commands of power. But in a democracy, in a liberal republic, in any state that claims to draw its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, your role is something infinitely more complex and more dignified. It is to be a citizen. The role of the citizen, as defined by the philosophical tradition we have just explored, is not merely to vote every few years. It is not just to pay taxes and obey the law. The true role of the citizen is to be an examined participant. Let this idea settle into your mind. An examined participant. Every society you have ever seen, every government that has ever existed, is built upon a set of answers to the great questions we have been asking. Every society has a theory of justice, even if it is an unspoken one. Every society has a definition of liberty. Every society has a line it draws between the public and private spheres. To be a subject is to live under these answers without ever knowing what they are. To be a citizen is to make these answers explicit. It is to hold the state's assumptions up to the light. The role of the citizen is to think, to question, and to engage. It is the act of applying political philosophy to your own community. It is the refusal to live an unthinking political life. This idea is, in fact, the very oldest idea in our tradition. We now return to where we began, in ancient Greece, to the philosopher Aristotle. As we have heard, Aristotle famously stated that man is by nature a political animal, politikon zoon. He did not mean, as we often mistake it, that we are all destined to be conniving politicians seeking office. He meant something far more profound. For Aristotle, what separated humans from all other animals, from a herd of beasts or a hive of bees, was our unique capacity for logos. Logos is the Greek word for reason and speech. We are the only animals, he argued, who can do more than just signal pleasure or pain. We can use speech to reason together. We can debate. We can ask, what is good? What is bad? What is just? What is unjust? Therefore, to be a political animal meant that to live a fully human life, to realize our complete potential, we must live in a polis, a community, and participate in this shared, rational project of determining the common good. To live alone, Aristotle said, one must be either a beast or a god. To be human is to be a citizen. This, then, is the citizen's role, to use our logos, our reason, to participate in the life of the state. And, if Aristotle gave us the definition of the citizen, it was his teacher's teacher, Socrates, who gave us the perfect example. Socrates held no office. He led no party. His entire role, as he saw it, was to be a gadfly to the state of Athens. He was a small, annoying insect, sent by the gods, as he said, to sting the great, lazy horse of the state, to wake it up from its comfortable, unthinking slumber. His entire life was spent in the public square, questioning everyone. He asked the politicians what they knew of justice, the poets what they knew of beauty, the soldiers what they knew of courage. And he revealed time and again that their confidence was unearned. He forced them to examine their own assumptions. This is a dangerous role. As we know, Athens, the great democracy, voted to put him to death. But in his death, he became the ultimate symbol of the philosophical citizen, the individual who, out of a duty to truth and to the health of their own community, has the courage to question power, to challenge assumptions, and to demand that the state justify itself. This is the role you have now been trained for. You now possess the toolkit for this role. The knowledge you have absorbed is not abstract or useless. It is a lens. It is a new way of seeing the world you already inhabit. From now on, when you read the news about a political debate, you will no longer just see two people shouting. You will see the fundamental, centuries-old conflict between two different concepts of liberty. You will see a clash between a nationalist and a cosmopolitan worldview. When you hear a politician argue about tax policy, you will not just hear numbers. You will hear the deep, philosophical argument between John Rawls's difference principle and Robert Nozick's entitlement theory. You will understand the moral vision that animates each side. When you see a protest, you will see a group of people challenging the state's legitimacy. When you read your nation's constitution, you will see the physical form of the social contract. When you hear a debate about law and the family, you will see the shadow of the public-private divide. This knowledge transforms you. It transforms you from a passive spectator or a confused subject into an active and informed citizen. It gives you the power to analyze, to critique, and to make conscious choices. Your vote is no longer just a guess. It is an informed decision about what kind of justice you believe in. Your conversations with your friends and neighbors are no longer just an exchange of opinions. They are a participation in the logos, the great, rational debate that Aristotle spoke of. Whether you choose to run for office, to organize your community, to write, to teach, or to simply be the most informed and thoughtful voter you can be, you are now equipped to fulfill the true, dignified, and essential role of the citizen, to live an examined life and to help your community do the same. You have now completed your foundational course in political philosophy. You have journeyed from the polis to the cosmos, from the individual soul to the global community. These ideas are not just trivia, they are the fundamental architecture of our world, and they are now part of your understanding. There is nothing left to learn tonight. There is no test to take, nothing to memorize. There is only to let this knowledge settle. As you now drift into sleep, let these concepts find their place in your mind. Let them form a new, clearer framework for how you see the world. You have done the work. You have learned the language of power, of justice, and of the state. Now, all that is left is to rest. Sleep well.